Oh, we're on YouTube as well.
Yeah, it's going to go to YouTube and yeah, so multimedia will be recorded. You can check all your views in the future, see, you can boost your social media presence. And then, hi everyone on YouTube. We're just getting started here. Going to start the recording soon. And all right, so we are live. Welcome to another Water, Wetlands, and Watersheds seminar. Today, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speakers, Dr. Tara Wade. And let me see where I have your bio is right here. So Dr. Wade is an agricultural resources economist in the Food and Resource Economics Department and the Southwest Florida Research and Education Center. So how do you say that? SWREC? Do you guys call it?
Yeah, SWREC.
SWREC, okay. She specializes in determining the economic factors that affect the adoption of conservation practices that help improve water quality and soil health. Her recent work examines the adoption of no-till. It's a kind of soil management practice in corn and soybeans, as well as cover crops and citrus production. She and her students also explore the factors affecting the adoption of multiple conservation practices, or what they call bundling. And her extension and research programs focus on helping farmers reach conservation goals in economically efficient ways and also are protective of the environment. So with that, Dr. Wade, I give you the floor. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, David. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to keep today's talk brief with the hopes that we can get a lot of questions and suggestions. This is really early work, extremely preliminary. So it's work that my student and I, Moon One, are doing. He really leads this work. And as David mentioned, I focus on the adoption of conservation practices in specialty crop production. I'm a certified specialist, so it's important that the work that I do be applicable. But we're trying to find this niche. There's a lack of information on or studies on bundling practices or adopting multiple practices at the same time. We want to explore that, and we want to explore whether these practices are complementary or not. And we want to use economics to do that. This paper does not do that. What we're hoping is that these are the first steps to kind of exploring that. So we look at 3 specific practices that I'll talk about that are used to manage groundwater levels. And so it's really an idea, but this is kind of the preliminary work, very preliminary work before we get to that goal. So let me start. My slide is not advanced. Okay. All right. So groundwater management is very important. There's a global issue where withdrawals surpass recharge rates. 57% of the world's aquifers have this issue, and Florida is no different. Florida groundwater supplies this huge agricultural industry and also the population that grows by 1,000 people a day. And this problem is not going away. In the next 20 years, ag water supply is expected to increase by 7%, and municipal water supply is expected to increase by 25%. So we really need solutions, and ag has a role to play. Now, why farmers would care about the water level, groundwater level, it's going to affect their crop growth. High water table can cause aeration and salinity problems. It can cause shallow root growth. And on the other hand, a low water table could help maximize root growth, but it could also cause water deficiency. So they have to find this optimal level to manage the water table, and that's going to depend on their location and what crop they grow. Florida has a very unique program, and I'm going to spend some time talking about this program because this is where the data that we're using comes from, and there are lots of caveats that I wanted to keep in mind as we're moving forward. I want to be as transparent as possible about the type of data that we're using, and it's not ideal, but we want to try this as a start. So Florida has this BMP program that is administered by the Florida Department of Consumer Services, FDACS. And They have manuals, BMP manuals, that outline specific practices that are appropriate for different production systems. And it covers all of the ag production systems. BMP coordinators or FDACS agents visit the farm, and they identify which BMPs are applicable and economically feasible. The farmer, and all of these, like I mentioned, come from one of these manuals. The farmer then decides that they're going to do these practices and signs a notice of intent. It's a form that they fill out indicating that they're either going to adopt the practice, they're not going to adopt the practice because it's not feasible, or they are already adopting the practice. Now, growers are required to keep records demonstrating that they're actually implementing these BMPs. And until recently, they were presumed to be compliant. About 3 years ago now, maybe 2.5, 3 years ago, Florida implemented a law that every 2 years, FDACS agents must visit each of these farms and ensure that they're doing these practices, and they keep track of nutrient records. So as far as compliance with their nutrients, they actually go and view records. I think it's eased up for this year because of the 2 hurricanes. But in general, every 2 years, they go and visit these farms. This wasn't the case until recently. Participation in the program is voluntary, but I want to talk, I'm using voluntary kind of loosely. If you are in a basement management action plan, we call them BMAPs, these are areas where the water quality is deemed less desirable than it should be. They have exceeded their total maximum daily loads of nutrients or other pollutants. So the state is taking action in helping to correct that. And BMPs is one of those actions that they're taking. So if you are in one of those areas, if a farmer is in one of those areas, they have to either adopt a BMP, the BMPs that are selected by FDACS, or they have to pay to monitor the water that comes from their property. So they do have a choice. So in that effect, it is voluntary. However, my understanding is that the monitoring costs are so high that it would put a farm out of business. Most would choose to enroll in the BMP program. If you're outside of a BMAP area, then I believe you can choose to enter the program or not. Participation in these programs, in the BMP program or the NOI program, makes you eligible for cost share. Most of the state's farm acres are enrolled in this BMP program at this point. This 54% I collected from a 2019 document. Keep in mind that enrollment is continuous. They're always enrolling and they're always doing these checks. So it's going to grow, the acreage is going to grow, the number of farms are going to grow over time. So the landscape might look different. So it should be more than 54% at this stage. So again, the data set is not ideal in that it's not voluntary in the sense that growers choose to adopt these practices. The practices are selected for them, and they do have the option to sign up for a program or not sign up for the program if they're not in a BMAP. If they sign up for the program, then they're expected to do the practices that were selected. If they are in a BMAP, however, their options are less limited, but I think for legal purposes, technically, because they have a choice, it is voluntary. So that's the data that we are using here, and I'll talk a little bit more about the data later on. I'm sorry, I noticed my slides keep jumping around. All right, so there are several irrigation, nutrient management, other practices in these manuals. We are focused on the vegetable and agronomic crop manual, and we're only looking at 3 practices: tailwater recovery ponds, the installation of tailwater recovery ponds, maintaining the water table at its lowest level, and installing a water table observation wells. These we believe directly affect irrigation, how much irrigation water is available, how much groundwater is used, and then how the grower will then manage their groundwater levels. I will say for tailwater recovery systems, I talked a lot about voluntary and involuntary practices. This practice would be truly voluntary. It is what they call a level 2 BMP, in that it requires structural changes and significant cost and engineering to the farmer, FDACS is not going to require a farmer to do this practice. So if the farmers who are doing this, that's a clear choice. We are particularly interested in this practice, but we want to see how it compares or how they're correlated to other practices that help to manage the groundwater levels. So what we'll do is the method that we're using, we can compare two practices at a time. And so that's where we're starting. So we'll compare tailwater recovery systems with maintaining the water table observation wells and comparing the tailwater recovery systems with, with observation wells, and the other one is the maintaining the water table at the lowest level. So our objective is to identify the factors that's affecting the adoption or selection of these practices. And we also, if we believe that the benefits are additive, you get more environmental benefits from doing 2, 3, 4 practices than you do from one practice, then we want to understand how we can encourage that. And that too might have implications for costs for education programs and for implementation itself. So we want to look at, we are going to be able to measure or estimate whether they're correlated, but next steps is going to try and be to identify complements so that we can really, can we target certain practices that make sense for farmers to adopt, that's more attractive for farmers to adopt. So first we're looking at the natural adoption of these two and seeing if we can model and capture some of these correlations. So the conservation practice adoption is not new in the economic literature. There are tons of studies that look at adoption, but most focus on single practice adoption. No-till, cover crops, conservation tillage, different specific practices. And most find that farm and farmer characteristics, climate, geophysical characteristics, geopolitical characteristics, play a role in whether or not a grower will adopt certain practices. I listed, I think, maybe 4 studies here. These are all either review studies or meta-analysis. So they give a long list of other studies that look at these different practices and can educate you on what affects adoption. Multi-practice adoption, and I'm calling them bundling for our studies, is not as widely studied. There is Lambert et al. In 2015. They looked at precision agriculture practices and as a means to reduce cost and increase revenue. There's a few that look at simultaneous adoption, and they use a multinomial logic to do that. That assumes that there's no correlation between the adoption of these different practices. That technique has that caveat. And then there are some that look at sequential adoption. And the idea behind sequential adoption is that a farmer will adopt an easy practice and then graduate to a harder practice as they gain some experience. So they'll add the practices one at a time. To our knowledge, no one is looking at complements except one study I can think of, Perry et al., that was published in AJE, that's our flagship journal. And they look at the adoption of glyphosate tolerant soybean seeds and no-till. Nothing for specialty crops and nothing for irrigation. So we are hoping to fill that niche or take steps to fill that niche with this work. We're using the Bivariate Probit model. This allows us to estimate the correlation between two different practices or 2 different sets of utility. So let's say that the utility, and you can think of utility as what a farmer would get from adopting or using one of these practices. A simpler way to think of it is maybe profits, that's something relatable. If a farmer were to get how much profits they would get from using one of these practices. So we have 2 equations. Say one would model the adoption of tailwater recovery systems, and another one would model the water observation wells, and you get the idea. And we run those 2 together. So what I'm going to present is the results from two pairs of analysis, one with the tailwater recovery system and the maintaining water observation wells, and the other one with maintaining the water table at a certain level, and the other one with the observation wells. And this row that we see is that estimates that whether or not the error term is correlated and how strong that correlation is between the error terms for the two regressions. So that's what we'll be talking about a little bit later on. So the data again, it's the NOI data that we're using. It's for vegetable and agronomic crops. We're using the 2015 manual, and we're only focused on plasticulture. The manual has other production systems. It has hay, it has bare ground, it has sugarcane. Plasticulture is what's listed with tailwater recovery. So we're limiting our analysis to just plasticulture since we're primarily interested in tailwater recovery.
Tara, can you for a quick second what plasticulture is? Some students here don't have the background.
So it's laying plastic mulch on the bed before when you plant. You lay a broad strip of plastic over the bed to kind of protect the bed and to protect the plant. It keeps things in, it helps, I guess, with erosion. So this is, think of when a bed is kind of, you go through the field with a tractor and you kind of pat that bed together with that tractor. And keep in mind, I don't grow anything. My explanation might not be.
That's fine, just general, that's like covered.
It's covered in plastic. The soil itself, where the plants grow from, is covered in plastic. And this lends itself, pardon me?
They poke a hole and they plant the plant through. Yeah.
Yes, and they do their irrigation underneath that plastic. They will fertigate underneath that plastic. They'll put nutrients underneath that plastic. They meet most of the plant's nutrient and irrigation needs underneath there, as opposed to bare ground where there'd be no plastic.
Okay, great.
So those systems lend themselves well to tailwater recovery, and they have their own environmental benefits as well. So as of 2020, May 2020, when we collected this data, remember I said enrollment is continuous. So if I try to collect this data now, the observations, this landscape would look a little bit different, I imagine. But we have 911 observations, or total acres just over 444,000. Average farm size is just under 500 acres. This is typical, I think, for Florida production. So I think we have a reasonably, we have typical farms for Florida. I want to say about the average acres, it's farm acres. It's not acres that the crop is grown on, and it's not necessarily acres that the practice is used on. It's all farm acres. So it could have reservoirs, it could have buildings on it, and it could have other production systems that are not included in the manual, like citrus or cattle or something like that. So it's really an indication of farm size, which is very important. We learn from other studies, and we find that it matters in this one as well. So adoption of these practices is low. Tailwater recovery, 11% and 7% of acres. Maintaining the water table at its lowest level, 10% of farmers, but almost 50% of acres. This is an indication to us that while a few farmers are adopting this practice, they are large farms. So the large farms seem to like this practice. And installing the water table observation wells, just under 6% of farmers and 14% of acres. And as you can imagine, when you start to pair these practices together, the adoption gets really low, or the use or selection is the preferred term, I think, gets really low. We take independent variables from other sources. Our climate variables are precipitation and temperature, 30-year climate data from PRISM. This is a county level variable. Farm and farmer characteristics, we mostly use data from the Census of Agriculture. So these are county level as well. And the farm size, however, is individual, that comes from the NOI data set itself. And then we have some geophysical characteristics, the water bodies, and they come from the National Hydrology data sets. We have GPS data for these, or location data, and we are able to pair the National Hydrology data set with the NOIs to make sure that they have ponds or reservoirs, or what kind of water bodies are on the farm. So here are the variables that are being used, and descriptive stats. So again, average temperature, precip. We also look at elevation listed in the climate variables. Farm size, I mentioned, comes from the NOI data sets. And we have average years on the farm, again, another census variable, about 20 years on average. So we're talking about mostly experienced farmers, mostly older farmers likely. And we include things like market value, but again, it's on the county level. More detailed data would be nice. The geophysical characteristics we look at are drainage, whether or not there's a stream or waterway on the farm, a reservoir or lake on the farm. And as far as geopolitical characteristics, we include water management districts. And our reference group here, sorry, it's not included, is the Southwest Florida Water Management District. So I mentioned that we do two sets of equations, two sets of regressions, and tailwater recovery is included in both of them. The tailwater recovery estimates they're very similar for both sets, so I'll just present them one time here. Sorry again for the slides jumping around. I'll present them one time here because you don't learn anything new from the other sets. And this answers our question. These sets will answer our question about, what are the factors affecting the use of these practices. So we find that for tailwater recovery, precipitation, temperature, and elevation matters. The higher you are, which is not very high for Florida, but the higher you are, the more likely you are to use a tailwater recovery pond. This makes sense because I imagine you need some elevation if you're going to dig a hole. So it makes sense that you'd want some depth. Temperature plays an important role. Average precipitation, it seems low, it's very significant. It seems small, but if you recall, when you look at the descriptive stats, that it's measured in millimeters, it's a pretty large number, so a small effect isn't actually a small effect if you consider how big that number is. Farm size is significant and negative. Again, it's a small effect. The average farm is about 500 acres, but this is contrary to what we typically think of with conservation practice adoption. Most of the literature is in agreement that larger farms are more likely to adopt conservation practices than smaller farms. We postulate that in this scenario, however, with tailwater recovery systems and with fresh produce production, we're talking about fruits and vegetables, the tailwater recovery system may pose a larger risk to large farms than it might to small farms because it's using recycled and treated water. It's using the water that runs off from the field. It treats it, and there might be concerns with introducing pathogens onto fresh produce. So I can imagine also if you're a large farm, you might have a large contract like Walmart or Publix or Target, and there may be even stipulations in that contract about how you can, treat the produce that's going to their stores. So this might have something to do with the risk aversion related to the practice itself and the farm size. We do find that the more experience you have on a farm is the more likely you will use this practice. And if you have a reservoir or water or stream on the farm, we find that this has a relatively large compared to the other variables and significant effect. And again, this might be an indication of just opportunity to use the practice. If you have a reservoir or streams and waterways on your farm, then you may have water available to use this, and you may direct that water to your tailwater recovery system. Relative to the Southwest Florida Water Management District, we do see that some significant, very small, because these are binary variables, very small but significant effects, but not different. You know, they're all 0, 0, 1. So I wouldn't say that they're that much different from the Southwest Florida Water Management District. About how well the model behaved, we have 89% prediction, which is really good for an economic model. It's really good for a discrete choice model. However, I want you to keep in mind, you know, some of the technical things that go behind these models. A lot of discrete choice models, or most discrete choice models, will overpredict depending on the distribution in the sample. So again, these practices were not widely adopted. So there are a lot more zeros than ones in the sample. So it will overpredict the zeros and underpredict the ones. That is just the nature of these models. It's still 89% accurate, but that's likely coming from predicting a lot of the zeros accurately versus predicting a lot of the dots, the ones accurately. So that's just something that we don't talk about much, but I like to keep it in mind when you're interpreting results. So now the results for the water, maintaining the water table at its lowest levels. So we want to look at the correlation between this and tailwater recovery system. And again, we see differences between the use of this practice, the factors that affect the use of this practice, and tailwater recovery. Similarities: temperature and precip matter. Elevation doesn't matter so much. And farm size doesn't matter so much for this practice either. Those are not significant, whereas they were significant in the other practices. Drainage has a relatively large, you know, has a significant effect. It did not have that much of a significant effect for tailwater recovery. And we hypothesize that this is because if you have good drainage, you might not be worried about the lack of oxygen in the root zone from frequent irrigation and things like that. So this might be less of a concern for you if you have proper drainage on your fields. And here we don't find any meaningful relationships between the Southwest Florida Water Management District and the other water management districts. Now, the correlation is what we really find interesting. This is significant, highly significant, and about 33% correlated with tailwater recovery. And again, our next steps in this type of work is to identify, okay, they're correlated, but are they complements? Is there any meaning behind this correlation? You know, can we identify complements? And then what kind of techniques do we need to look at for that? Now, the other system is installing water table observation wells, and this looks more similar to the other practice than tailwater recovery system. And again, correlated, even more so correlated with tailwater recovery systems than our other practice. And we're really predicting those zeros well. We have 94% correct prediction. Maybe as the sample changes and more growers adopt these practices, if we have a more balanced data sets, then we could probably really get at these predicting accurately these zeros and ones. So this is what the predicted probabilities look like across the state for each practice, you know, and the practice adoption is low, and we don't expect that it's adopted everywhere, because it's really going to be important. Adoption matters where you are and what you're growing. So some of these systems may not even be appropriate in certain areas. And you can kind of tell that based on the, you know, how things are here. The tailwater recovery ponds seem to mostly be in the panhandle. And maintaining water table levels seems to be, you know, central and south, southeast, southwest. And water observation wells, which I think we had really low adoption there, those seem to be mostly in the southwest part of the state. So again, you know, where you're located, what you're growing is going to matter in terms of what is going to be appropriate for you to adopt, or what FDACS is going to select for you. So again, the adoption of these technologies is low. The factors that significantly affect the selection of tailwater recovery ponds are different from the other practices, but they seem to be correlated. There's a little correlation between them and the other practices. Temperature and preset play a large role in all the practice selection. Farm size, the water management districts, and temperature play a larger role for maintaining the water table than the water observation wells. And again, the tailwater recovery is correlated with the two, but more so for one practice than the other. And why we care about this work, is being able to identify complements. Hopefully we'll get there. It may reduce the cost of BMP education, and it might reduce the cost of BMP implementation as well. If we could target complements and BMPs with additive benefits, we could have meaningful environmental benefits, and these benefits could come from the same acres as opposed to looking for additional acres to find these benefits. So that's kind of what is motivating this work. How can we maximize the environmental benefits from these practices on the same farm or in the same fields? And that's where we are with this right now. Like I said, I left plenty of time for suggestions. This is very, very preliminary work. It's probably not an ideal way to use the FDACS data sets, but we are very grateful to have it. We're very grateful to be able to explore these questions and our partnership with them. And this work is partially funded by our multi-state hatch and also by one of our SCRI grants.
All right, thank you very much, Tara. So we'll take questions from the room as well as Zoom and YouTube. YouTube is usually pretty quiet, but I'll check over there. And I'll launch us off with a question. I'm interested, you said a couple of times that the adoption was, pretty low and a lot of zeros, but then, the predicted probabilities, the maps of green that you showed at the end, for some of those practices, 30, 40, 50%, they don't feel to me super low. So you can just maybe comment on this idea that tailwater recovery, which is a really big investment, it's, requires, as you said, infrastructure. Well, I guess, where do you think it should be if it's low now, or maybe contextualize low for us a little bit?
If it's one of those things that I think probably will, and this is my opinion, it's probably going to remain low. I think it's what's at 11%. Yeah, it's 11% now. It's 100% voluntary, and it seems to be high risk. Maybe once the technology for cleaning the water improves, but while this cost is as high as it is, here's the issue. It has a lot of potential to save water, recycling the water from the farm, but you're going to need acres to really make it count. And what this is showing, and again, it's preliminary, and we have lots of caveats with this data set, but it's showing that large farms don't find this attractive. So with that, and then is it something that, if it's really that expensive, can we expect small farms to adopt it? I'm not sure how much.
Can you show the predicted probabilities near the end of this? You had like 3 maps on one slide.
Yeah, so the tailwater recovery, we have 33% to 70. And again, when we're doing this, we don't want to, well, it's predicted, so we're not, this isn't the actual probabilities, this is what our model is thinking.
Given elevation, given temperature and all that stuff. And I guess the point being that, statewide it might be 11%, but if you've got a, I don't know, Santa Rosa County or whatever it is out there in the panhandle that has the attributes right, but it's being fitted with a statewide model, and it may not, the attributes may be right to predict it, but the crop might not be right. So, I guess that's a caveat of the model.
Yeah, and there are lots of other attributes we could put in the model. We played around with a bunch of stuff. At one point we had whether or not the field was ponded. And the other thing is how is Florida is so different from the rest of the country. So using these national data sets that I don't know have been ground truth for Florida, but this is what we have available. So yes, if those attributes match what we have in the model, then we're predicting that that adoption would be feasible there.
Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, hey Tara, this is Mark Clark. How are you?
Mark?
I've got a suggestion, I guess, with regards to a possible additional variable you might add in, which may help tease things apart, and that would be the general type of irrigation practice being used.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, just the Swanee, which doesn't seem to correlate very well, is mostly unless it's rain-fed irrigation, is overhead. They're rarely manipulating the groundwater table for any of their irrigation practices. Whereas, certainly down in South Florida and Hastings, in the Tri-County area, I'm less familiar with the Panhandle, but where you're looking at a groundwater manipulation or groundwater observation wells and things like that, that's when they're usually manipulating the groundwater table as their means to facilitate irrigation. And so if that's a practice that's not even used in that region, that as a BMP is not even going to be, kind of in the cards. So it might just be an added variable that might improve some of the predictions in the different regions.
And I did look through, when I was prepping for this talk, I did look through some of our other models. We had a variable for irrigation, not the type of practice though, just whether or not the field was irrigated. We got that from FSED. At the time, it was FSED 5.
Mm-hmm.
And but I think you're right, getting at what type of irrigation is used might be helpful, would be definitely helpful at teasing this out. I don't think the FSED gave us the type of practice that was used, and the NOI data does not give us the type of irrigation. We just know whether or not we know whether or not they used an irrigation BMP.
Right.
That doesn't mean that other fields were not irrigated. They just didn't use an irrigation BMP. The other variable that I think we could play around with to get at some of what you're saying is the production system. We're limiting this to the vegetable and agronomic crop manual. And this means that we're limited to the types of production systems that are included in that manual. So like I mentioned, there's sugarcane, plasticulture, bare ground, and hay. And the issue that I have there, or the concern I have there, is that we cannot connect this manual to other manuals, which may then have other production systems. So I can't tell if someone who is in this manual also has a cow-calf operation or also does citrus. So these are some of the challenges with this data set. And I think what a lot of this is saying, I really like the questions that we're asking, but this may not be the ideal data set to ask them. We might need to seek funding and do some surveys. But the nice thing about this data set is that there are observations, there's data. So you still want to try and learn everything you can learn from it, because I'm not going to get 900 observations doing a survey. And, so there's this trade-off constantly about, the best approach to answer these questions. But thank you for that. I'd have to look into where we can either find a proxy for the type of irrigation system or with the actual irrigation system. I don't know if we'll find that.
Yeah, I don't know how site specific you could be. You might talk to some agents within those regions, because I think that those general irrigation practices are probably going to be, somewhat common in those regions. I do have another question, but I'm not going to ask it till the end because it might take a little while. It's philosophical.
Any questions? Yeah, Karthik.
In one of the slide, it suggested that BMP.
I'm sorry, I'm not hearing this person.
In one of the slide, BMP suggests to maintain low water table level. Something is there any specific reason for that?
He wants to know about what is maintaining the low water table. Why is that a BMP?
It's optimizing your water use in general. That's just one of those practices that you want to make sure that you don't overuse the water from the water table. One, it will hurt crop production, but you don't want to overuse the water because of, it's that recharge versus withdrawal balance that you're trying to get. Now, I could not tell you what those numbers are. That's the other issue with a lot of this type of work, is that the science doesn't connect nicely to the economic question all the time. So I can't tell you how much water would be saved from using this practice versus not using that practice. But the purpose is to, what growers raise the water table to help irrigate their fields. So you want to do that just enough for the plants, just enough so it's beneficial for the plant. You don't want to overdo it, and you don't want to for the grower's sake, they don't want to underdo it either, because it will hurt production. But for the public, you don't want them to overdo it, because that's water that we need for other resources. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. Any questions from our Zoom students? Before we let Dr. Clark.
Yes, please.
Go ahead, Khalid.
First, I would like to thank you for your informative presentation. My question is almost, let's say, similar to what my colleague just asked. For optimizing the water use, I just want to know if, because what you saw is that the temperature is the most affecting factor on maintaining the water level. So how the farmer can control this? It's something, let's say, out of his hand.
Exactly, and that's why it's in the model. This is an exogenous variable. It's something that the grower cannot control. So it's something, but it's something that affects their behavior. So we want to see then, how is it that a farmer observes high temperature, then he's more likely to do these things. Well, what should the policies around that, or how do we help a farmer that observes these higher temperatures adopts these practices? But it's not to say that the farmer can manage the temperature. He can't. It's completely out of his control. What he can manage is his farm management practices that are affected by the temperature. So whether he's going to irrigate more, or use another type of irrigation practice, or grow another type of crop. It's similar to say, if you were to add prices to the model, crop prices. The farmer has no control over what the market says this crop price is, but it will affect what he does. Maybe he'll grow something else this year, or, so that's what we're looking at. We're looking at what affects behavior, not necessarily what they can change. The only thing that we assume the farmer can change is whether or not they adopt this practice. Everything else in the model should be things that the farmer cannot change.
Okay, can the farmer use, let's say, two practices at the same time? So if, let's say, one of them doesn't succeed?
Yeah, that sounds like you're touching on risk. If they want to adopt two practices to help mitigate the risk of another one. Yes, what we are trying to look at, can they adopt two practices because they are complementary? Because one goes well with the other one, as opposed to using one instead of, if one goes badly. So there's a different type of question, but yes, absolutely. And if that is the case, we would use a completely different type of model, because what you're saying is that the adoption of these two practices is very deliberate. So we'd have to have an instrument for that other practice, because one would be directly correlated with the other one. In practical terms, it makes sense. However, for us, it doesn't identify cause. And if we want to identify what causes the farmer to do those things, then we have to put in things that are out of the farmer's control. So things that he doesn't have a choice in doing. But yes, I think a farmer could use one practice to mitigate his risk of losing crops and what have you, along with another practice. Yeah, kind of like an insurance policy. They could very well do that.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
No
Clay.
problem.
So I don't know.
I just have one question. What's the likelihood of, I guess from like a specific standpoint, how many farmers tend to adopt multiple practices versus just a single practice? Like what's the correlation, I guess?
I don't have the numbers for you, but in general, this is low. These 3 practices are low. In general, most farmers adopt more than one practice, especially in Florida, and especially given the that FDACS NOI program. They're usually selecting more than one practice at a time. So
Okay, so-
think of like a suite of practices or a system of practices. That is what is encouraged.
Yeah, so if they're participating at all, they're more likely to do multiple.
Yeah, yeah. And the manual has a ton of practice. Keeping nutrients records is a practice. So, you know, so technically, if you look at the data, you'll see multiple adoption across the board. But is now that we are cherry picking specific practices, it seems low. But farmers in general are adopting several practices at once.
Back to Dr. Clark, yeah.
So this is more of a philosophical issue or clarification with regards to where BMPs fall within the purview of the agricultural interests implementation. In general, or at least historically, let's say before it was tied to any sort of a regulatory environment like BMAPs, BMPs were always meant to optimize profitability for the farmer. It's it's those practices that were determined to maximize yield with minimum while minimizing cost. And IFAS generally still promotes that type of quote unquote BMP. They are not constrained, if you want to call it that way, by requiring that those same practices are indeed nutrient limiting or water conserving. They are not constrained by that. They can basically recommend a BMP purely for profitability. Whereas when a BMP enters into the ag BMP manuals, then they are under the auspice that they are providing some sort of nutrient reduction mechanism and or a water conservation mechanism, and that those practices are technically feasible and quote unquote economically feasible for the grower to implement. And so, when you do have a TMDL and then a BMAP, as you mentioned, the growers, so the agricultural interest in that watershed, are supposed to adopt those BMPs or do some sort of monitoring to show they're in compliance. My question is, because there is a list of practices that are in those manuals, and they can choose to some degree which practices they adopt, then technically, all are pretty much feasible. It really comes down to this economic question. So at what point is the economics of adopting all of the practices versus a subset of practices a means by which the producer could essentially say, well, I can't economically adopt any of these? And case in point, recently, IFAS made a recent recommendation. I'm focused more on the nutrient side than the water quality side, but that growers could apply a much higher level of nutrients in the form of phosphorus than what the historic recommendation was. And the argument was because that would maximize yield, i.e. maximize profitability. But yet that increase in phosphorus significantly increases the amount of nutrients they're going to get applied. So IFAS recommendations is, again, not being constrained, but the grower made the argument that, well, this will maximize my yield, so therefore I shouldn't, they could make that argument for just about anything other than a practice that's also economically beneficial for them. So in this whole selection process, I'm just kind of curious where this trade-off between a requirement that is under the auspices of basically the BMAP compliance and the grower's obvious interest to maximize economics versus some sort of responsibility that they would have, or I personally would think they should contribute to address things like water consumption and nutrients. So, granted, it's a big question, but it's kind of at the heart of this trade-off between practices that are wholly in the interest of the growers because it's economically viable versus some requirement or participation in the state's effort to address degraded water quantity or quality.
Yeah, I'm not sure you have a question in there.
Well, no, I said it was philosophical. It really is it's just a kind of over blanketing all of this idea behind what is a BMP and under whose definition.
Right, and FDACS has an agenda, NRCS has a different agenda, so water management districts might have their agenda. As an economist, as someone who, works in the field, the farmers face trade-offs constantly, and they have to make decisions constantly. Like we talked about the weather, they can't help if they get huge rainfall or, right after they spray or right after they apply the fertilizer. They're constantly trying to manage events and manage these trade-offs. If you want someone to willingly adopt something in general, it needs to be economically feasible. It needs to help them make money. These are businesses. They are 100% businesses. So we have to manage the public expectation. We have to manage growers' expectations. We need to provide the information that proves that these BMPs are economically feasible. And we also need to provide the information to the farmer that proves the environmental benefit. I don't think we're doing a very good job of that. We're just telling them that this makes sense and asking them to make a financial decision based on that. They adopt these practices at their costs and at their risk. We just we're not catching up to the growers' needs. And then I would say in my field as economists, we then need to provide policymakers with the information that they need so that they can get creative in how to administer some of these policies so that we get more win-wins. But we're not going to have, everybody is not going to be happy with any of this. And then the question is, who should bear the brunt of this? And again, as an economist, it's really fascinating, this Florida program, because these are private landowners. I can't think of many other places that tell private landowners what to do on their land. But it's working, it seems. But yes, there is some conflict there because, I don't think we are doing a good enough job of providing the science, providing the numbers, and then communicating this information to the farmers so that this decision is easier for them and more palatable for them because they're doing it at their expense right now. Cost share exists, but it doesn't cover all of it and it doesn't exist for everybody. So those who are doing it at their cost. So we need to show them that this benefits their farm as well. And it's hard work and there's no one size fits all, so.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. All right, let's give another round of applause to Dr. Wade. And I think we'll continue talking about this semester, next semester. The farmers aren't happy with the regulation. The environmental groups aren't happy because the environment is being degraded. And so either we're in the sweet spot where we're compromise is like, okay, or like we're just totally whipping and failing on all regards. So I'll leave it to you to think about maybe in your write-up, are we failing on all regards, or do you think we're kind of like on track, but just need to tweak? So thanks, Tara. We appreciate it. Thanks everyone on YouTube. We will see you all not next week. It's Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. We'll see you the following week for our final, I think our final seminar of the semester, which is Dr. Johanna Freeman talking about pollinators and wetlands and habitat and